Not just the NHS that's under pressure for more money. You may remember the government set out a new national funding formula for schools in England last year to try to address discrepancies in the amount of money schools received across the country. So all fine now? Well, no. A group called Worth Less, which represents thousands of schools across England, is claiming that there is still a vast and unfair difference between the highest and lowest funded schools. We can speak now to head teacher and the campaign's organiser, Jules White. Jules, the government insists that more money is going into schools year on year and that they are going to have a fairer formula with winners and losers. Do you accept that?
I think there are some differences there. Over the past 5 or so years, the government was planning to take £3 billion out of schools. It decided to put back £1.3 billion. That's helped some of our budgets, but it's simply we're facing cuts right across the board. And in terms of the national funding formula, unfortunately, a new funding formula has been put forward for April, but it's full of caps and arbitrary increases, so it's not really being implemented in the way that it should be. And as a consequence, thousands of schools up and down the country are still facing a financial crisis, and there are simply huge differences between those who have and those who have not.
Right. In terms of your school, will it be getting more money?
Yes, we do get some money. We're raised to the very bottom threshold, so every student in my school will rise to £4,600 per pupil. But that compares to some London authorities where pupils are funded at over £7,000 per pupil. So if you take my school, it's about 1,500 pupils. My budget is £6.5 million for April 2018. A school of exactly the same size in Hackney is funded at £11.2 million. That's £4.5 million more, 70% difference. And to give you some idea, £1 million would buy me approximately 30 extra teachers, 60 TAs, countless textbooks and equipment. And as a consequence, my school is struggling to survive. We don't want money taken away from London schools, but we want a much, much better deal for our children and our families.
But in order to set a new formula, do you accept that it's based on the need and characteristics of each individual school? There may be very good reasons that those London schools that you mentioned are getting more money than your school.
Absolutely. Schools have to be funded differently according to need and factors like deprivation. But as I've said, the new national funding formula is not being implemented like that. London schools got an arbitrary 0.5%, yet most schools across the country, even though they were lagging behind by millions of pounds, were capped at 3%. That's because the government overall is taking money out of our system during the lifetime of this Parliament.
All right.
And the figures that we're quoting, they all come from the Department of Education. I'm not making them up. You see schools, for example, in an area like Bury, they're funded at about £4,800 per pupil. In nearby Manchester, the figure's well over £6,000. So again, that equates to 1,200 pupils, one school being funded at £1.5 million less. Those differences are absolutely huge.
All right, thank you very much for joining us. With me here in the studio is Shadow Schools Minister Mike Cain and Conservative MP Chris Philp. Listening to that, Chris Philp, if you look at the figures themselves from the government, there is no real terms increase when you take into account rising costs for these schools and increased pupil numbers.
Well, up until 2015, real terms per pupil funding was rising. There was a 2-year period from 2015 to 17 when it did go down a little bit, and those are the pressures we're hearing about. However,
but they're extreme, aren't they, those pressures?
Well, however, from this April onwards, that's 2 months' time, extra money is being put in. So just to give you the numbers, the budget this year is £41 billion. Next year, it's 42.4, and the year after that 43.5. So it is being protected and it is going up.
But the point is, yes, but you're still ignoring the fact that the point is it's not enough when compared with the parallel rising costs of running these schools and teachers' wages and salaries and increased pupil numbers.
So if you take those funding increases I just laid out and you adjust them to account for increases in pupil numbers and inflation, schools will either be protected or see slight increases. So that is being addressed going forward. It's also instructive to look at international comparisons. comparisons because of the 32 OECD countries. We come 6th out of 32 for education funding, ahead of France, ahead of Germany, ahead of Japan and ahead of Australia. So those international comparisons are quite illuminating as well.
So why are there schools like Jules White's who are having to make the sorts of cuts that actually led to many people making this the issue that they did vote on in the election, and it wasn't for the Conservatives?
Well, that's right. And I think we recognised over the summer that there was an issue here because of that 2015 to 17 period. And that's why in September we announced we announced the extra 1.3 billion, and that will hit classrooms in April of this year, in just a couple of months' time. But also what's important here isn't just the amount of money put in, it's the results that are achieved. And over the last 7 years, 1.9 million more children are in good and outstanding schools than 7 years ago. So yes, the money is important, but the outcomes are important too. And the outcomes in our schools are very, very good indeed.
What do you say to that?
Well, Chris hasn't taken into factor that there's more children in our school system, that school inflation is running ahead of ordinary inflation, pension contributions, the apprenticeship levy, and the fact is that the National Audit Office are telling us, Joe, that this government is taking £2.7 billion out of the system from 2015 to the end of the
Well, Chris Philp has admitted that there was actually a lag in funding for those 2 years. What do you say about the results and the numbers of children that are in better schools, according to the government?
Well, 1.9 million children in better schools is a statistic. Those schools were all identified actually as coasting schools under the last Labour government, who put the money into those schools. So they're dining out on our record with that. But if you look at the Key Stage 2 SATs, the differentiation between those on free school meals doing well, the huge inequalities going up, and your phonics have gone back. And Michael Gove and Justine Greening clearly made the PISA targets, the international targets that we compare our standards with.
Well, Mike,
in 2010, let me just finish this point, and we are going down the PISA indicators.
Well, is that the case when it comes to maths, English and science?
No, well, our schools are obviously and measurably better now than they were 7 years ago.
But hang on a second, but you need to give the evidence for that. In what way, if you're using...
Because according to Ofsted, 1.9 million children are in good and outstanding schools. That's gone from 67% to 89%. But Mike mentioned inequality, and I'm proud to say that in the last 7 years, the attainment gap between children from deprived backgrounds and average backgrounds has narrowed by 10%. So those children from deprived backgrounds are doing better now than they were 7 years ago. And that is the measure of a compassionate, effective education system.
Well, it all depends, of course, which measures you use. But why is it that some schools in England receive 50% less money than an identically sized school?
Well, it's really for historic reasons. I mean, these funding formulas go back some decades.
No, but you put out a new funding formula that should have addressed this.
So, and that's right. So let me finish. So that will come into force from April of this year. Now, as the piece said, it's going to migrate over a period of about 3 years. So it's not going to be like flicking a switch where everything changes in 1 year. As he said, for schools who are underfunded, which actually includes secondary schools in Croydon, they'll have their funding increased by 3% a year over a number of years, over 3 or 4 years, until they've caught up. So my secondary schools in Croydon, as it were, deserve about a 10 to 12% increase, and that'll come in over a 4-year period.
And what are they supposed to do in the meantime? I mean, if you're hearing about curriculum being having slimmed down, if parents are being asked to contribute money to their local state primary and secondary schools because of these budget cuts on those 2 years and going forward until the new funding formula is bedded down, what are these schools supposed to do?
From April of this year, so from 2 months' time, that extra money will start to hit schools. So the Croydon secondary schools that I represent will get an above-inflation per pupil increase in about 2 months' time.
Right.
So
more
and
money.
It'll accelerate after that.
So what the numbers suggest is a real terms cut in education spending between now and 2020, and that's the first time that the school's budget has been declining
not between
in
now
real
and 2020.
terms.
No, that's not right.
Since the 1970s. Now, how is that expressing itself? It's expressing itself in terms of the workforce, and what we see is that we have the lowest teacher tenure in the OECD, and all the international evidence shows you that the best way to get the best results in schools is great teachers.
All right.
If teachers are leaving the profession in droves, and we have the lowest school teacher tenure in the OECD, we're storing up problems now and for the future.
We're going to have
now than ever before. We've got record numbers of teachers.
Since 2000, because we've got record numbers of children. Since 2011, Chris, a third of teachers who have trained have already left. UCAS have just released yesterday, that they are 29% down on their recruitment figures for next September. This recruitment and retention disaster is only being exacerbated by this schools cuts programme.
We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you for coming in.